Every single cup of coffee on Earth, no matter how it's brewed, traces back to a small number of countries, a couple of plant species, and one specific origin point most people have never actually heard explained clearly. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly where coffee comes from, country by country, which nations actually grow the beans versus which ones just brew them, why some origins cost 10 times more than others, how altitude and processing actually change what ends up in your cup, and one number for each that will genuinely change how you read a coffee bag forever. This is the complete no-skipping map of where coffee actually comes from, and once you see it laid out, you'll never look at a grocery store coffee aisle the same way again. You've probably read a coffee bag before without really understanding what half of it meant. Single origin, washed, processed, Arabica, high altitude, none of it actually told you anything useful, so you just grabbed whatever was on sale that week. After this video, that same bag will read completely differently. You'll know why a bag from one country almost always costs more than a bag from another. And it won't be a mystery anymore, it'll be an actual explanation you can point to. You'll know which country is quietly responsible for most of the instant coffee and cheap espresso blends you've ever had, without you ever noticing its name printed anywhere on the label. You'll know exactly what you're paying for the next time a menu says single origin instead of just saying coffee, and whether that price actually reflects something real. This isn't trivia for its own sake. It's the difference between buying blind and buying like someone who actually understands the map behind the bean, and can explain why two bags that look identical taste nothing alike. Let's start at the actual beginning, Ethiopia. This is where coffee genuinely comes from, not just culturally, but genetically, and that distinction matters more than people realize. Nearly every Arabica variety grown anywhere in the world today, across South America, Africa, and Asia, traces its genetic roots back to a small number of wild coffee trees still growing in Ethiopia's highland forests, often at elevations most other origins can't even reach. Coffee here isn't grown on massive industrial farms the way it is elsewhere. It's still overwhelmingly smallholder farmed, often on tiny plots passed down through families for generations, frequently growing wild, or semi-wild in forest shade rather than in cleared, uniform rows like a plantation. Here's the detail almost nobody realizes. Because so many wild and heirloom varieties still exist only within Ethiopia's borders, the country is essentially sitting on the genetic backup library for the entire global coffee industry, a level of biodiversity that literally doesn't exist anywhere else on the planet, and one that scientists actively study to protect future harvests everywhere. This one is for anyone who wants to understand where the actual starting point of the whole industry sits on a map, rather than where it simply ended up. Now here's one that people constantly confuse with just being a coffee-flavored dessert. Yemen, long before coffee reached anywhere else in the world as an actual cultivated crop, it was already being grown deliberately in Yemen's steep mountain terraces, centuries before it ever left the region at all. The port city of Mocha became so central to this early trade route that the name eventually stuck to an entire flavor category worldwide. Even though modern mocha drinks have almost nothing to do with actual Yemeni beans anymore, decades removed from the original supply chain. Here's the number that explains why Yemeni coffee stays so rare today. The mountainous terrace terrain makes mechanized farming essentially impossible, since almost everything still has to be tended and harvested by hand on impossibly steep slopes, which gives Yemen some of the lowest yields of any coffee-producing country on Earth. Despite having one of the oldest and most genetically distinct heirloom bean populations that exists anywhere in the world, this one is for anyone chasing the closest thing possible to tasting what coffee may have actually tasted like hundreds of years ago, before industrial farming ever existed. But the next one operates on a completely different scale than anything before it, Brazil. This single country produces close to a third of all the coffee grown on the entire planet, more volume than the next several largest producers combined. A scale no other origin on this list comes anywhere close to matching. Brazil grows both Arabica and Robusta across enormous mechanized farms, concentrated heavily in regions like Minas, Gerais, São Paulo, and Paraná, using harvesting equipment, irrigation systems, and export logistics that smaller origin countries simply can't match at any comparable scale. Here's the number that puts that into real perspective. Roughly 1 in every 3 cups of coffee poured anywhere in the world in any country on any given day can be traced directly back to this single country's harvest that same season. That means whether in Brazil alone, a single unexpected drought or frost hitting one region can shift global coffee prices for every other producer on the planet almost overnight. Regardless of how well their own harvest performed, this one is for anyone who assumed coffee production was spread evenly across dozens of countries, when in reality, one nation quietly anchors the entire global supply chain almost single-handedly. Now to Colombia, and this is where scale gets traded for precision instead. Unlike Brazil, right next door, Colombia grows almost exclusively washed Arabica, cultivated up in the Andes Mountains, typically between 1,200 and 2,000 meters above sea level, an altitude range that slows down how quickly the coffee cherries ripen. That altitude and the specific washing process are exactly why Colombian coffee became one of the most recognized single origin names in the entire world. Printed on bags long before most people ever knew what single origin even meant as a concept. Here's the detail that surprises people. Colombia's mountainous geography actually makes large industrial megafarms impractical across most of the country. So the majority of Colombia's coffee still comes from small and mid-sized family farms, working steep terrain almost entirely by hand, not sprawling flat plantations like Brazil's mechanized operations. This one is for anyone who wants a reliably consistent, smooth cup without needing to gamble on an unfamiliar origin they've never actually heard of before. But the next one might surprise you the most because it barely existed in global coffee conversations just a few decades ago. Vietnam today. Vietnam is the second largest coffee-producing country on the entire planet, and it supplies roughly 40% of all the Robusta grown anywhere on Earth, a dominance that happened remarkably quickly by industry standards. Production is concentrated in the Central Highlands, in provinces like Dak Lak, where high yields and low growing costs made Vietnamese Robusta the price anchor for instant coffee and commercial espresso blends worldwide, quietly setting prices for products most people never associate with the country at all. Here's the part almost nobody connects together. If you've ever had a cheap instant coffee packet or a budget espresso blend anywhere in the world, in almost any country, there's a very real chance Vietnamese beans were sitting quietly inside it, even though the label never mentioned the country by name at all, because most blends simply say Robusta or blend without naming the origin. This one is for anyone who assumed Robusta was a lesser afterthought bean, when an entire country built a global commodity empire on exactly that variety alone. Now to Indonesia, and this one processes coffee in a way that genuinely exists almost nowhere else on the planet. On the island of Sumatra, beans go through something called giling basah, or wet hulling, where the coffee is hulled while it's still semi-wet, instead of being fully dried first, like nearly every other origin in the world does it. That single processing difference is exactly why Sumatran coffee tastes so distinctly earthy, full-bodied, and low in acidity compared to almost anything else you'll find sitting on a shelf. Here's the twist that connects back to something you may already know without realizing where it came from. Indonesia is also the same country that produces Kopi Luwak, the notoriously expensive coffee made from beans that have already passed through the digestive system of a small cat-like animal called the Asian palm civet before ever being collected, cleaned, and roasted like any normal batch. This one is for anyone who wants a genuinely different flavor profile in their cup, not just a different country name printed on the label. And now, the twist almost nobody expects, all the way out on a single mountain range in Jamaica. Coffee is grown on one specific mountain range on the island, and by law, only coffee actually grown within that officially defined region is legally allowed to use the name at all. Anywhere in the world, on any package, total production is tiny compared to almost every other origin on this list, which is exactly why it commands some of the highest prices of any coffee anywhere on Earth, far above nearly everything else you'll ever find sitting on a shelf next to it. Here's the detail that explains where it actually goes once it's harvested. A large share of the total harvest is exported directly to Japan under long-standing trade agreements that go back decades. meaning most people outside a fairly small circle of dedicated buyers may never even encounter a genuine bag of it in their own country at all. This one is for anyone who thought they'd already tried the most expensive coffee humanly possible, right before realizing an entire mountain range was quietly outpricing almost everything else on Earth, without most people ever noticing. So which of these origins have you actually already had, probably without realizing it? Ranked from most likely to least likely, it goes like this. Brazil sits at the top, since its sheer volume means it's blended into an enormous share of commercial coffee worldwide, labeled or not. Vietnam comes next, hidden inside instant coffee, and budget espresso blends far more often than its name ever appears on a bag. Colombia follows, common enough as a labeled single origin that most grocery stores carry it without any effort. Ethiopia is harder to find, well, mostly showing up at specialty cafes, willing to source small, traceable lots. Indonesia's Sumatra beans are rarer still, usually reserved for darker roast blends rather than everyday grocery shelves. Yemen is close to impossible to find outside dedicated specialty roasters, given how little the terrain allows it to produce. And Jamaica's Blue Mountain sits at the very bottom, both because of how little exists and because so much of it never leaves its existing export agreements in the first place. So there you have it, 7 countries, and almost none of them get equal credit for what they actually contribute to your cup every single day. Some operate on a scale of tens of millions of bags a year, feeding grocery stores on every continent. One operates on a single mountain range, with legal protections built directly around its own name. If you remember only one thing from this video, remember this. The coffee industry isn't spread evenly across the world at all, no matter how the shelf makes it look. It quietly depends on just a handful of countries doing almost all of the heavy lifting, while dozens of smaller origins fight for whatever attention and shelf space is left over afterward. Which one of these origins had you actually heard of before this video? Is there a coffee-producing country from your own region that I didn't mention here at all? Tell me in the comments below. I genuinely read every single one of them. And if this changed how you'll read your next coffee bag, hit like and subscribe, because this channel covers the strangest, most surprising sides of food from every corner of the world.